welcome to Books Between Bites and our annual program by Mayor Jeff Schielke. He was the first speaker at the very first Books Between Bites when we were at the Methodist Church in 1986. So we've had him back every year except for the COVID gap time period. I'm Becky Hogue. My parents started this program, and we're delighted to continue it here at the library with them co-hosting this with us and getting us all set up every month. And I just wanted to tell you, there's some flyers in the back that we have added a program for one of our dear Batavians. Marty Mamaga has written another book with Mary Parks, the children's book. They had a great program in April last season, and they've already written the next book. And so we have added to Books Between Bites for Thursday, January 30th, for Marty and Mary to present their program. So there's some flyers back there, and I posted it on our website, and hope you'll join us for the extra bonus session in January. I think I'm just going to turn it right over to Mayor. Who needs an introduction? But we thank him for coming and has some new ideas to tell us about things he's found. So, and I see, he always brings a great.
Already got next year's.
Huh? Oh, he already has next year's. Okay, I'll put you down. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm very, very pleased to see the size of this crowd on a nice day like this. I'm sure there's other things many people could do, but I appreciate everybody wanting to come and hear what I have to say. As it's been said, Lee Moore had asked me to start this whole thing off when he was going to kick it in, and he said we wanted to have some kind of a local sentiment in some of the speeches, and would I be able to. And I can't quite honestly remember the book I did, but it was locally received. And so as this has kind of evolved, I've always, the last 10 years or so, it's always been some kind of a Batavia story or something that's been written about Batavia that we've talked about. And today I'm very honored to be able to review John Dillon's new Batavia book that he has just basically kind of finished up. And we're honored to have his mother Rosemary in the audience with us here today. And John couldn't be here. He was already pre-obligated to be out in the western part of the United States in search of wood. He's in the wood business now since he's retired, and so he's out doing some research on that. And so he called me the day before yesterday, and we had quite a nice conversation about things I was going to say, and I wanted to confirm my observations and facts and details. And he says, sounds like it's a good plan to me, so I'm going to go ahead and do this. Now, we're going to talk about the water system a little bit, but there's a lot of side stories to this whole thing that I think you will find very interesting because, to tell you, well, down Prairie Street we laid 1,300 feet of lead pipe, that doesn't really do much for anybody. But we have some very interesting history with this water utility in Batavia, and something that I'm very, very honored to have. And so why don't you put the first slide up? Okay. This is now a 2-volume book, and the first one goes from the very beginning, from 1893 to 1903, and then let's go to the next one. Second book is from 1904 to 1913. And by 1913, the water system that we now have, although most of the pipe has been replaced over the years, it's kind of in the same locations and the same places. And one of the beauties about Batavia is that we have our own water resource right beneath us. And the Newark Aquifer, which is just west of Batavia, out near the entrance to the Mill Creek subdivision, the city of Batavia has its water removal system, its pumping system, and that's where we pump it and treat it, and then we ship it down Fabian Parkway to Main Street, and then we come in Main Street, and if you may have noticed, we have this huge pipe behind the West Side Fire Station. and that's the storage tank that we fill, and then overnight we fill the rest of the system off of that tank. And so we get that pretty low in the morning, but by now it's all pumped back up. So we have great water. I am told by the state of Illinois, our water quality is one of the best in the state of Illinois. And so I'm feeling very fortunate that we're not shipping it in here from Lake Michigan or someplace else, that we got enough to do it. And it looks like some of the other towns that were using the Newark Aquifer have now gone in different directions. And so there aren't as many taking from it as there once was, although the populations are growing, so that will maybe change it a little bit. But we're in pretty good shape in the water, and John Dillon's leadership in the water utility for the years that he ran it, it was really sought to be improved technologically, and was at a time when we brought in the computer and all the analysis and stuff. So we've always had kind of the right people in the right place for this thing since 1893 when we started it. Let's go to okay, you're right with me here. These are a couple of people who kind of played a big role in this thing. And at the bottom is a picture of John Dillon when he retired. And as I say, John really kept an eye on it. He knew where every pipe was going, how it was going to work, how big it was, where we needed to replace it. We got rid of a lot of lead-based pipe over the years. So we're in good hands thanks to John Dillon. Up above us is a picture of Tracy Holbrook. Now, Tracy Holbrook didn't know nothing about water. Tracy Holbrook was a musician, and he was born and raised in Batavia, and he was a child prodigy at a very young age. The story about him is when he was 3 years old, he gave a church concert with using an accordion. And then later, when he got done with that, he got into the violin. And by the time he was 6 years old, he was ranked as one of the top child violinists in the United States. And so he got recruited there was a nationally circulating orchestra called Rooney's Concert Band. And he got, at age 6, he got brought into that band and was hired, and they had some other young people in the band with him, so they hired a school teacher to go along with him, and the school teacher taught the kids when they weren't playing. And so as a result, he went all over the United States. And the story is that in 1906, when Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States, Tracy Holbrook went into the White House and gave a concert before a large audience at the White House that Theodore Roosevelt had asked him to come in and perform. So he had some pretty notable things. Well, as he's touring around the United States, he was making money. And he made enough money at a very young age to buy himself a camera. And so then there was apparently a couple months every year when he got downtime, and so he could return to Batavia, where his mother and his brother lived up near the intersection of North Van Buren and Franklin Street. And if any of you remember Jenny Larson, who was at the Batavia Savings and Loan for many years and later was city treasurer, Jenny was his neighbor and friend of his mother and his brother and everything else. So Jenny ended up with some of the Holbrook family artifacts because there weren't a lot of descendants to pass things on to. And so Jenny ended up finding this book that he had, and come to find out what this was is that when he got to be in high school age and he'd get his time off, he'd come back to Batavia and he got himself a girlfriend here. And the girlfriend's name, some of you may remember, was Madge Grimes Spencer. And she lived right at the corner of North Washington Avenue and Wilson Street. She later married the gentleman who was our Justice of the Peace, so the police used to go over to her house at all times of the day and night and knock on the door and let him give people a traffic ticket that they had just given them and fine them. But Madge was an artist, but she was also a school teacher. And she got in with Mooseheart when they were starting Mooseheart, and she was one of the first teachers hired at Mooseheart, and then later she became the principal of the school at Mooseheart. And so she was an artist, and she painted a lot of things, and there's a number of pictures of the creek that runs down through the southwest side of Batavia into Mooseheart. And she must have painted every different direction of that thing there is, because I personally own 2 different paintings of hers when she was on the creek. Well, as it worked out, her family married into my family, and I'm kind of a descendant of the Condys, who were over on the east side since 1835. And so as a result of that, I had this opportunity to kind of know her when I was a younger person. And so Madge used to talk about it. And so one day, Jenny Larson shows up and has this book of all these pictures in it. And so I went down and asked Madge what was the story. Well, she told me, she says, it's kind of a dark tale in my life, is the way I guess she described it. She said, I was pretty romantically involved with Tracy Holbrook, but he was always having to go off and leave me and go around the country. So one time I came up with the idea, she did, that when he's back, I'm going to take him and we're going to take this camera that he's got, and we're going to walk around Batavia and take pictures of all the men. Now, you have to appreciate this is right around 1905, 1910 time period, and it's back in the days when women held somewhat of a gift status lower than men. And so as it worked out, this book was created and there's not one woman's picture in it. It's all men. And so they would go, and some of them, Madge said she had made previous arrangements with somebody to take their pictures, some of the merchants and other people, but then there were some of the earliest industrialists like the Van Noordtreeks and the Newtons and some of those. They didn't want anything to do with these kids wanting to take their pictures, so they would camp out in front of their business waiting for them to run out, and then they would take a picture of them. And so some of the pictures in the book are of kind of the guys yelling at him or something that he didn't want his picture taken, but it's very good. And so she said that, Tracy said that in his band that he was with, that there was several black musicians in that band, and that he had a really good relationship with the black musicians. And so if he was going to participate in this book, he wanted some pictures of the black men in Batavia. So they went up in the northeast side where at the time all the blacks lived, and they got, I'm missing a page in the book that I was looking at. I think they got 20 different black men's pictures taken. And it's all the prominent descendants of many of the early black families. But this was all done because Tracy had this idea that, blacks were equal to everybody else and they were great musicians, and so we needed to get their pictures in the book. So they took all this, and then there was only supposedly 2 or 3 copies of this made. They had to print 477 pictures, and then Madge, I guess, pasted them into the book in the same direction. So Madge had one, Tracy had one, and it's still kind of a mystery who had the third one. Can we go to the next picture? So, along comes the idea that we needed to do something with this book. So one day I get a call from Jenny Larson, who was kind of an old family friend, and she said, Jeff, would you come up to the house? So I went up there, and she says, I've got something to give you. She says, Les Holbrook, the brother, he had a copy of the book, and he's died, and I have it, and I really think it should go to somebody who can take it into future generations of Batavia, so I'm going to hand this off to you. So she handed it off to me. It's very nice of her. So I think it was I had just been elected the mayor of Batavia in 1981. And so I then had command of the Batavia Police Department, obviously. So I said to Denny Anderson and Bob Popick, who was kind of the photo unit, I said, one of the things I'd like to have us do is some night when you're off duty, come on down here and we're going to copy this book and make a couple more copies of it. So the deal is that we ended up making 3 copies. And so what happened is that we took the 3, and it was right before Christmas, so Denny Anderson gave one of the copies to his father, Cliffy, I gave one to my father, Don, who was a member of the Senility Club, and the old boys and that had all kinds of fun with this. And then I gave one to Bill Wood, and that was the crowning moment when I gave it to Bill Wood. Bill Wood was just overwhelmed by this book. And so right away, Bill Wood starts deciding that, and this is Bill Wood's picture here if anybody can't, and these are my two secretaries, both of them were with me for more than 20 years, Susie Petkus, as on the left as you're looking at it, and Jeanette Armbruster on the right, and they were just best thing that ever happened to me as far as being a secretary. They really, really did a great job. And they knew everybody, and they knew towns, and they knew who the nuts were and the troublemakers, and they would alert me who was calling the mayor wanting to have some conversation. And so Bill brings this book in and shows it to the girls, and then he says, I got to find out some information on all these people. So first the girls went to got a hold of our, we own 2 cemeteries, so we were able to go and see this person buried in the cemetery where most of them were. So then we had a date of when they died, so then Bill could go to the Batavia Heralds, which I guess we keep here in the library now, and he was able to thumb through those and get information. So he started writing biographies, or at least dates of birth and death of all these people as to who they were. And this really became a very treasured thing because it wasn't a bunch of faces nobody knew. And when I had a conversation with John Dillon the other day about this, he said that Holbrook book, I said, well, you got Bill Wood to thank for that. And John Dillon and Bill Wood had some very interesting supportive relationship. When John was a student at J.B. Nelson School, his father was on the city council. And there used to be an unnamed street in front of J.B. Nelson School from Laurel over to Chestnut. It doesn't have a name on it. So John Dillon came up with the idea, let's name this street after Mr. Wood. So he took it to his father, and his father threw the idea out on the city council floor, and the alderman said, great idea. So they passed an ordinance right then to name that street, and then the next meeting they had Mr. Wood come down as a surprise, and Bill and John got the credit, and from that moment on, John Dillon was one of Bill Wood's favorite people. And so if John Dillon wanted any information, it's interesting. John told me the other day that he started writing this book in 2007, and Bill Wood had died in 2005. So my 2 gals, who were still kind of around, they kind of knew what he was looking for, and they were able to help a little bit in getting everything kind of up and down. So this book has an interesting story because it's had a kind of a wonderful experience out. It was done something that should have been done. It got handled by the people that did okay with it, but then it got finally distributed to people who could make copies of it. So I'm led to believe we now have a copy of the book down here in the Batavia room at the library, and we have one at the Depot Museum. And if anybody wants a picture of their ancestor, I think you can probably go into the library one here and go to the copy machine and make a copy of it. There's no copyrights on it or anything else. It's just this great history of all these men from Batavia at the turn of the century. So let me tell you a little bit about the water system. That's what we're really here to talk about. The water system in Batavia was really non-existent up through 1893. And then can you go to the next picture? In 1893, this was the East Side School, which stood over where the old Louise White School is today at State and Washington Avenue. And on January 10th of that year, the year had just started, they think that the janitor had thrown a bunch of wood into the furnace and was burning it up to keep the school warm, and some of the wood or sparks or something got out of the chimney and landed on the roof and started the school on fire. Now, goodness name, God must have had his hand in this because all the kids got out of the building burning. It was up above them, so they were able to get all the kids out of the school, and nobody got hurt or whatever have you. But let's go to the next picture. This is what it looked like when it was over with. The building was totally gutted. There was nothing left of that school. And so they had to, best they could, they had to move the East Side kids either into downtown stores or over to the west side, and they had to get because at that time the two schools were in separate districts. That was a few years later that they united the east and the west side schools. And up in the top pictures there are the two fire companies we had, and they just had a hose reel, but the only way they could get water was to put up some kind of a tank and then put a little pump in the water and pump the water, and that took time. And most of the time things were burning down because the Batavia Fire Department really didn't have any motorized equipment of any magnitude or anything. So that was a catalyst to kind of not only start a water system, but a fire department. So that was a major event in Batavia, was the burning of the school. So let's go to the next slide. All right, I want to call your attention to the picture of the guy down in the corner, and his name is Guy Condi, and he was the original member of the Condi family, and he lived his entire 94 years, I think it was, at his family's residence at 210 North Washington Avenue at the corner of Spring and Washington. But Guy Condi was a senior in Batavia schools on the day of the fire. And the school had just had a big activity to raise money to buy themselves a clock so that the teachers would know when the end of the day of the school was. So this clock was up on the second floor in the principal's office, and the building catches on fire, and they had all the kids out of the building, and all of a sudden Guy Condi breaks away from all the kids standing outside and runs into the burning school. And everybody's screaming and howling, "My goodness gracious, what are you doing?" Well, within about, I don't know, 30 seconds, all of a sudden here comes Guy Condi running down the stairs with the clock, and he's holding it above his head, and he gets out on the sidewalk, and all the kids are, "Ooh," and he says, "I'm saving time." And that, as far as I know, that's a true story, because Louise White, who later became the principal of the school and who we now have that school on the east side named after, she said that she was there and she was just dumbfounded when Guy Condi did that trick about running into that burning building. So this is the next thing that happened. The water world, the insurance world came in and raided Batavia for how good its protection was for insurance purposes. And this is about as bad as you can have it. It says we didn't have fire equipment, we didn't have a water system, and basically we almost shouldn't be insured because there's no activity that is going to be ever taken care of. So with that, the editor of the Batavia Herald newspaper started a campaign that Batavia needed to have a referendum to build a water system. Now, I'm really thankful to John that he dug into all this stuff and got all this out so it can be saved. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that was published in the Batavia Herald was this article. Now, the only way you can read it is if you're Swedish, because it was all written to promote the referendum to the Swedes that then lived on the west side of Batavia. And so they got somebody to write this Swedish article in support of the water system for the Batavia schools, or Batavia's community of Batavia. So this is all written in Swedish, and John got this article and copied it and put it in the book, and it's an interesting story about, that he had to do that to get the referendum passed. So then a month or two later, they had the referendum, next picture, and the final vote was 303 votes in favor and 110 against it. So the water system got approved. So right away, the city council jumped on that and started buying the equipment they needed to put in the water system. And obviously, they needed it specifically around the downtown area because those were the places that were most probably endangered by it. And so let's go to the next slide. The original water system that they bought cost $26,542. And that got it out to the residential fringes and got the downtown kind of covered with water systems. So I thought that was an interesting, but that was then all going to go on people's bills or taxes, and now it's all billed. It's all billed to you to this day. But that's what people in Batavia started. But they had to pay to get the system from the street into their house. That was individual people had to pay that. So not every house had a water system in it. Some of them still had the outhouse in the backyard and whatever have you. Next picture. So one of the big moments is that the city of Batavia built itself a water tower. And this was really a great thing, because then you had water in storage, you didn't have to pump it. And if you had a fire or some type of emergency, so this water tank sat over on East Wilson Street, and the site is kind of still there today. We have a small city water building on the property. It's just to the east of Prairie on the north side of Wilson, and you can go in there and pay your utility bill on the driveway, and it's next to where the Feldots used to live, if any of you can envision that, and this water tank was there. But one of the things that the city council had to do was they had to post signs on the water tank that there would be I think it's a $26 fine if they caught anybody trying to throw rocks either at the water tower. I guess the competition was all the kids would stand at the bottom and try to throw a rock that would go up to the top and then fall into the tank. And they didn't want that, so they had to, John found that little piece of information and he put that in. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things we started getting then, because we had this water system, is that we had all these farmers around Batavia that had a need for water because they had cattle and pigs and need stuff for planting corn and whatever have you. So one of the things we needed in Batavia was a dairy where you could bring your milk or whatever into the dairy and have it done. So Key and Chapel Dairy was one of the first industries that came into Batavia because we now had a water system. And Key and Chapel Dairy is kind of still there today, parts of the building. And if you look real closely at it, it's now part of the restaurant where at State and River Street, where I can't think of the first name, it's not the Pal Joey's. It's down where Pal Joey's is. And they've added on to this building a number of times, but this is one of the things that came very quickly because of the water system. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Well, another thing that really kicked in, now they had built themselves a building that was the Newton Wagon Company, and that later was to become the Batavia Body Company. So we switched from making wood wagons for farmers, but we made thousands of them because in downtown Batavia we had the river power and we had the water power from the city system, and so that really kicked the thing into high gear. And so thousands of wagons were made because also we had railroad track running through downtown Batavia, and one of the tracks on the west side came right into the Newton Wagon Company building, and they could load the wagons on the railroad train, take it back up and take it up to Geneva or Aurora, whichever, and put it on the main lines and ship it. So there were thousands of wagons built. And then when wagons kind of fell out of favor, it got switched over to refrigerated truck bodies. And so most of us who were around in Batavia in the 1960s can remember when the Batavia Body Company was still there. Now, you talk about there's a real water story with this one. The Newton Wagon Company, or the Batavia Body Company, closed down on June 29th, 1973. And so for 4 years, the building kind of sat there empty. So because it had all this wood initially with it, one of the things that was done once we got the water system in is they put a fire department sprinkler system in the Newton Wagon Company. So it had been there a long, long time. So the building was sitting there empty, and on January 19th, 1977, at some point, we're not sure when it all happened, but the sprinkler system had been fully charged in case something happened in the building, but the owners had turned off the alarm system notification on it, so if the alarm went off and the sprinkler came on, it would start flowing and nobody would get called about it. So on this date, it was about 15 below zero. And back in what my mother used to describe as my wild and crazy youth, I was a member of the Batavia Fire Department volunteer group, but they had a deal where they hired back 2 of us every night to sleep with the one paid guy. and then you had to be there. So on January 19th, 1977, I was working at the fire station, and Denny Thomas, who was on the police department, comes running in the door, and he says, "Guys, I think I better have you come over to the body company. The building's looking kind of strange there, and I think something may be happening inside there, so you better come over." So Bob Strand, who was the full-time fireman, and myself and another guy got on the truck, and we go over to the Batavia Body Company, and we get there, and you could see that the front door was moving. It was like waving back and forth. And so Strand says, "Well, let's get the Halligan tool and pop this window or door open and see what it is." So I got the Halligan tool and propped open the door, and oh my goodness gracious, this flow of water came down the stairway where this door was, came out onto Wilson Street at such a fast rate that the next thing Strand says, "Get in the truck and move it down the street because this truck is getting surrounded by water." And it got so bad that we had to shut Wilson Street down for a few hours to get all this water out of there. And it just kept coming and coming and coming, and it was 20 below zero, so it didn't take long before we had an ice rink right in the middle of Wilson Street because of this. Now, fortunately, it was like 10 o'clock at night, and there weren't many people around, so, you know, it was okay at some degree. Never good at any time for this to happen. So this water just wouldn't stop running. So finally we got on the phone and we called Charlie Chemis, who was then the superintendent running the Batavia water utility. So Charlie comes running down there and he says, "Oh my goodness gracious, let me go down to the water system." We had a monitor in the city hall which said how much water had been would flow through different pipes. So he goes down and he comes back about 20 minutes later and he says, "Well, as near as I can do my math," he says, "as far as I can tell, about 585,000 gallons of water flowed into that building before it got detected that it was filling the building." So Bob Hodge was the fire chief at the time, and we finally got it so it was just kind of dripping out of the building. This is about 2 o'clock in the morning. So Hodge says, "Get the hand lights and let's go in this building and see what's like in there." We walked in there and it was like a refrigerator or ice box. I mean, all the walls were coated in ice, the ceilings were coated in ice. Hodge says, "Well, we aren't going to walk very far in this thing. This whole building could come down any moment with all the weight of this thing, and nobody's paid any attention to it." So he ordered the building be boarded up and secured. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but it was only stood about another 2 weeks, and the owners had to come in with wrecking balls and tear the thing down. So basically, this building was destroyed by water. And the history of what the Batavia Body Company / Newton Wagon had been was over with. No, let's go to the next slide. Okay, one of the things that Batavia had in those days, and this was a real shot in the arm for these, was we had a couple of hotels. And this was the Howell Hotel over at Van Buren and Wilson, where Berkeley's now is. And this is where a lot of people who rode the train through town would stop and go in there. And we think this is in 1865, this statue we have of Mark Twain out here in the entryway. We think he stayed there one night because it kind of shows we've got a book in the library of all of his speeches that he gave, and it talks about the speech in Batavia. And he gave a speech the night before over in southern Michigan, and he left Batavia, then came to Batavia, gave his speech, and then left Batavia the next morning and went to Freeport and gave a speech there. So we know the trail that he was on, but he stayed in Batavia one night, and we think it was over at the Howell place because the train, Steve Lusted, who's now passed away, that was the assistant fire chief, he was a big train buff, and he had the old schedules, and he figured out what train Mark Twain would have had to take to get himself into Batavia to do the schedule of this performance that he did. The one thing that the Historical Society is still in a mystery about is where Twain spoke. We're not sure. Nobody doesn't say anything about it. It gives a speech that he talked, but he doesn't say anything about the building. He talks about good-looking girls in town and everything else. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, this was the other hotel we had in town, and this was right down the street here on the west side of Batavia Avenue. right across what I guess now is a nursery school there in the old bank. But this was the, this is, what do we call this one?
Revere House.
Revere House. This was the Revere House. And this one was where a lot of local business people stayed. And so we think Twain could have stayed here, but we think it was more they was put him near the railroad track on the east side because the schedule he was on would have gotten him to Freeport on the trains that he had. But what was interesting about it is that both of these hotels indicated through conversations and stuff that John was able to find that their business went up because there was more people now wanting to stay in a hotel where you didn't have to go out to an outhouse in the back, or you could go to have a bathroom inside and whatever have you. So that was a real shot in the arm. Next slide. So this is kind of one of the big stories. It talks about a $150,000 fire. Well, the $150,000 fire was not in Batavia. It was just up the street in a little place called Fargo. It's in what today is Geneva, but if you go up Geneva right across from Fabian's, you'll see Fargo Boulevard. And Fargo was an industrial town that the Van Noortrijks had built there as a place that was near water and again near some railroad tracks, specifically the Northwestern that was in Geneva. So they were very interested in putting a factory there. So they put the factory up, but Geneva, like Batavia at this period of time, didn't have much in the way of a water system or a fire department. And as the story goes, the whole Fargo factory of the Van Noortrijks burned down. They lost everything in the fire. So supposedly Mr. Van Noortrijke then made the decision that he was not going to be in this position anymore. So he looked around and he came down to Batavia where they now had a water system and where he could get river water. And so he ended up buying the building, which are the Batavia Government Center and all the other stuff that has since been tore down. And so Van Noortrijke was very, very pleased with his purchase of that because he, I had a picture of that. I think it got mixed up here. Well, yeah, we're on 18 here. Can you get me to 20? Yeah, okay, there it is. This is the picture of the building that Van Noortrijke built. And I'd call your attention to some things in this picture. This is kind of, number one, it's surrounded by water at the moment. The Depot Pond is on the west side and the river's on the east. And it's obviously connected to the new city water system. But Van Noortrijke, when he built the building, he made it all one story. But if you and I go down there today, the south end of it is 3-story. Now the story of that is supposedly Van Noortrijke got all this built and some of his advisors or friends came along and said, John, this is a great building, but you got a problem here. You got this thing surrounded by water, and what are you going to do some night if the river rises and you're going to lose your entire inventory in this place? You need to have some place where you got an elevator and you can put stuff in and move it up higher. So if you go to City Hall today, and I know some of you have been there, and you go into the council chambers, you'll see these great big wood support beams all through the room. And those were put in after the building was built to support the 2 additional floors that Mr. Van Noortrijke then made the decision to build so he would keep himself away from the river water if it started to overflow. And so then he also, the elevator is a new elevator now, but the shaft is still there. And if you go there, we have a shaft that goes all 3 floors that goes in. And then the rest of the building is 1 story. And supposedly the Van Noortrijke's idea is that the stuff that was really valuable, they'd put that in the front building along with the office. And then anything that was expendable, they kept those in the 1-story buildings that are shown in the picture here. Much of that today is the garage for the police department, and part of our police department is in that building. And we probably need to do something about doing some nicer facilities for the police department, because that building and its design really leaves a lot to be desired, but that's for another time. Anyway, Van Noortrijke had this idea that he was going to move all this stuff around. and he did, and he kept the building business there as, you know, the Appleton or windmill factory, and he sold a lot of windmills out of there, and he could load them on railroad tracks and whatever have you. And so then he ended up, you know, we had the U.S. Wind Engine and Pump Company windmill factory, which is further to the south of this, and that again is on the river. And then across the river we had the Challenge windmill factory. So all three of those were, at one time, Batavia supposedly was the windmill manufacturing capital of the world, but we had the ability to, number one, have the power through the river and our water system to make the windmills, and then we had the railroad tracks then on both sides of the river, which are now the bike trails that we use, and we could load all these heavy windmill kits on the railroad cars and ship them out. And it all made sense with three windmill factories. You know, there were thousands of windmills, and to this day I occasionally get a call from, like, somebody from Australia was the last one that called me and wanted to know where in Batavia he could call to order some windmill parts for his windmill that was wearing out in the southern end of Australia. Well, obviously we don't have that anymore, but it just shows you how this water thing has quite a legacy in Batavia as time goes on. So one other thing I'd like to share about this building, and talk about a legacy, is the Van Noordtreeks stayed there till probably the late 1940s in some form, and then they ended up selling the whole complex to a company called Dunbar Capital, and some of you may remember Dunbar Capital. Dunbar Capital had a division within itself called DK Aerospace, and they started making components for the U.S. space industry. And so we've got some documentation that twice Wernher von Braun, who ran the space program for the United States in the mid-1960s, came to Batavia 2 different times, and Les Hodge, who was the plant manager down there, told me this himself, that twice Wernher von Braun came to Batavia to test some of the things that we were doing. And one of the things that he wanted tested was the fuel lines that were going to be used in rockets. Because goodness knows, if you launched the rocket and went up into space and then the fuel line broke, that ends the whole program right then and there. You're gonna, if you got any astronauts on board, they're probably gonna be killed and everything else. So they wanted to invent this new line that would not break. And so apparently they did, and they had a laboratory at the front of the building, according to Les, which is now where our city council chambers is. And in the late 1960s, they made a thing called the flexible fuel line. And the flexible fuel line was in the rocket that landed on the moon in 1969, was made in our city council chambers. And so that's quite an interesting piece of Batavia history that was there. So kind of ironically, and I just this morning was at another meeting that we had with some folks that were trying to get some grants to put some nice signs up that will tell a lot of this story. And we were sharing with them that, you know, if you go buy the book First on the Moon, and you probably can't buy it, but it's in this library down here, you can check it out. I believe it's on page 77, and it was written by the 3 astronauts after they came back. They got together with an author and they wrote this book for First on the Moon. And on page 77, it says the flexible fuel lines were made in Batavia, Illinois. So we have that part of it. And so ironically, that area, according to Les Hodge, when he talked to me, the DK Aerospace was about on the space where our new flag monument now is. So that was there, and that was one of the things that happened. So we also have a picture that's in this building in the I think it's the 1916 Batavia High School yearbook that shows the girls and boys who were then in the West Side 8th grade class of Batavia High School that year. And in that class was Marion Moon, whose father was minister of the Methodist Church right down the street here. And she's the mother of Buzz Aldrin, who put the American flag on the moon when they landed. And then the other girl, there's another girl in the picture, and that's Beth Sagrand. and her father and her lived down South Batavia Avenue, and he gets some of the credit for being one of the founders in 1916 of getting Woodrow Wilson to declare American Flag Day June 14th. So we've got this really kind of unique connection to the Americans landing on the moon. I remember when it happened in '69, I was working as a reporter for the old Batavia Herald, and we get a call from NBC News in Chicago, and they wanted to know, was the Moon family really from Batavia? And their name was Moon, and yeah, it was. So next thing I know, here's this team of photographers and whatever, and we were kind of hard-pressed. Nobody in the newspaper knew anything about it. And I called Dr. Gustafson out at the Gustafson's house, and she says, well, the one we need to get is Lydia Jean Staffney.
Oh, yeah.
Because she's an old friend of theirs from the Methodist Moons, from they were friends. So we called Lydia Jean, and she would not be on TV, but she would talk to him on the phone. So they did a little story about it on channel, I think it was Channel 5, about the Moon family from Batavia and being a minister and all this nice stuff. So those are kind of some of the kind of interesting stories that Batavia has going with this whole thing about, you know, because we got that building in town because of the water capabilities. We got that there. So let me continue. I'm about done here, so don't worry, we're going to get that. Let's go to the next picture. So another thing, that once we got the water in the toilets, we needed to have a good sewer system. So that became the next, that followed the water system. So there was another set of referendums, and I guess people understood the value and the need of a good sewer system because it got installed. So first you got the water, and when you had the water, you needed the sewer. So that was kind of chapter 2, as John told me the other night, of what really happened. And he had this great picture of them right outside the street, down the street here, putting the sewer line into Batavia Avenue. And that was the main line, both the water and the sewer, so they could get it near the city operations. Okay, let's go to the next picture. All right, one of the next things that happened, because we now had this new water system, is Batavia school system needed, they thought they had 2 different school districts in Batavia, an east side district and a west side, and neither one of them had a proper high school. But they thought it was time to do this, so again we had another referendum, and Batavia people voted to, number 1, consolidate the 2 school systems into one, with the idea that we would then build a new high school at this location, which by now the Van Noortrijks were moving out of Batavia because they had used all the water and what they were doing here. So they bought the Van Noortrijke property, which was on the site where we're currently sitting, and they ended up tearing all that down. Now the long story on that is that they started building, they passed a referendum in 1912. They started in early 1913 to build the building, and it wasn't until almost 1916 before they got the school done. And they ran into all kinds of structural problems in building the school because this is on the side of a hill, and there was all this shifting and stuff like going on. So it wasn't an easy school, and several times they had to tear some stuff down and rebuild it, and it was a very challenging moment. So we got to the point that it got to be the high school in 1912, or 1915, 16. And so that was given as the real first year of the new Batavia High School. And then it fell to me to be a senior at Batavia High School in September of 1966, when they moved the junior high school into this area and they put the new high school out on Main Street. So I was in the first class, my senior year. We left the high school we had been in for 3 years, and we went out to the new one. Now, for whatever reason, somebody thought it would be a good ceremony to have all of us walk. We met here at San Bartolo and said goodbye to us all, and then we all walked out, and they built a sidewalk on Wilson Street. There wasn't one yet on Main, which now there is. But the whole class walked out to that area, and we said goodbye to the old school. It was kind of a ceremonial thing. I don't know anybody that ever made anything of it, but we got a nice exercise out of it. So we got out there, and that's kind of where it was. So then we moved the junior high into here, which was another whole new idea, and we had Sam Rotolo, who jumped on it and did a fabulous job, as everything I could see, about bringing the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades together and having a junior high here. And Sam got a lot of credit for everything that he did and kind of putting this building together. But then the building started having its problems. And so then we had to have another referendum to build a new junior high. Well, that started out with quite a political negotiation, I would say, because I was by then the mayor of Batavia, and we got involved in this, and I was very supportive that we get this all taken care of. And so the Bethany Lutheran Church inherited money from a parishioner. So they had some money. So the school district had just built a new HC Storm School, so they didn't need McQuain here anymore. So the Bethany Lutheran Church used their money that they had inherited to buy the McQuain School. Then the school district decided, well, they got some money in their pocket now, and the library was going to build the new library here, so let's buy the old school district office with that money from the library, and then the library would have the money to then take it and use it to build the new library. So it was a good track of money. It took a little consternation of getting everybody involved in the conversations to agree to everything, but it all worked out. So then we get to the moment when they're going to tear the old high school down. And so there was a lot of consternation, I will keep using that word, a lot about that people did not necessarily appreciate or like. It's been a lot of sentimentality toward the old school. So one of the things, Jim Benson, some of you may remember, was our city building inspector. And he and John Dillon, as I remember, came over here along with some other people from the fire department or whatever. And we did an inspection on this old school that was about to be torn down. And it basically flunked every test of the test, because as it worked out, and some of you I know went to that building and have some memories of it, if you added up all the stairs that were in this building that started on the first floor and went to the third in 2 or 3 different areas, and then you went down into what they called the old gym, and then you went over into the gymnasium that had been added, there was a total of 272 stairs in that building. And you had all these people who had handicaps and whatever and couldn't go up the stairs. And at the end there, in high school, we had teams of us that would, on a certain hour, we would all meet at point A, and we'd take the handicapped person and go up 2 flights with them to get them on, and then we go back and bring them back down. I mean, there was stuff like that. Plus, structurally, the thing totally flunked the fire department test because there was no sprinkler system. The stairways were too small. It just wasn't going to pass the test. So at the end of the day, and I have some pictures that people took, and there's a movie been made about it, and I don't want to get into it, but it was all about, the building had to come down. And so that one is kind of where that is. Go to the next slide. So another story I wanted to tell, this is James Stewart, who was an early Batavia businessman, and he had a store on Wilson Street, on the East Wilson Street Hill, going up on the north side of the street. And he was a barber, and he cut hair. And he had a lot of the Caucasian folks went in. He was well liked, and he had a back room to this barber shop, and so he would rent it out to other blacks for an opportunity, so I am told. And one of the things that happened was he had a gentleman come down here from, I believe, Maywood. He had been in Waukegan, then he went to Maywood, and then he came to Batavia, and he was a shoe repairman. And he went into Batavia and started repairing shoes, and then he was also supposedly trained as a minister, And so Batavia had what today is the Logan Street Baptist Church, but they didn't have the funding to keep a full-time minister going, so they had various part-time guest ministers in their church. And supposedly this guy's last name was Robinson, and Reverend Robinson would go up there maybe once or twice a month in 1927 and 28, and he would give the sermon. Yeah, it was fine. And then in 28, he ended up moving himself out of here because he was married and had some kids, and he moved to the south side of Chicago. And last anybody heard of him till recently. There's a book in this library that I've checked out that's the story of Michelle Obama. And Reverend Robinson was the father of her father. So he was her grandfather. And so we had that connection. So Batavia's just had all kinds of interesting connections to it, all of those things. Finally, the last story I wanted to tell was, we're getting ready to tear this building down, and these guys show up from Kentucky. And they say, we'd like to come into this building you're going to tear down here, Mayor. We'd like to take out the drinking fountains in the gym, and we'd like to take out maybe a part of the gym floor, maybe 10 by 20, and just cut it out and maybe the center of it, because we'd like to buy that, because that's the gym floor that both Dan Issel, who was a Kentucky Colonel, and Ken Anderson, who was a Cincinnati Bengal, they both played on that floor. And we'd like to have that down in Kentucky someplace. We'd like to have it, so can we buy that from you? And I said, well, it's not mine to sell. So I called the school district, and they didn't know what to say. So I got back to the guys, and I said, well, the wrecking company just wants it out of there, and they got it out, have it out by, it was a couple days away. They said, well, we'll have our crew in there tomorrow, and we'll get it out. And we're going to send you a check. I said, they ain't sending me any check. I have nothing to do with this. Well, who should we send the check to? So I said, okay, let's send the check to the Batavia High School Athletic Department. Right. Since they were the ones, it was them that kind of sponsored the guys and the teams and whatever have you. So that's kind of the way the whole thing. So it's almost time for me to quit, but one of the things I wanted to do is the final thing here, is I had another cousin called Mary Condi Wilson, and she was a writer and wrote a couple books, and she wrote a lot of poetry, and every now and then she'd write something about her hometown. And last year, I ended this, we were near Christmas, and she had written a thing about Christmas in Batavia. And I don't even remember, I had several people ask me for copies of it. So I found in going through her, my Aunt Irma Jeffrey, who some of you may remember, was kind of knew her as a girl, and she, Mary Condi had given her some of her work, and I've got a couple of pages of stuff that Mary Condi wrote in hand, so it's not easy to discern what she's trying to say, but she wrote a thing about Batavia in the month of October. So I just wanted to read with you what was written, I think, in about 1883. About Batavia in October. The month of October brings to each year the sentiment of changing times, where we feel the cool of the winds and the brightness of the sun, and set forth the message that the year will soon be ending and new days soon will offer a new calendar for us all to see. What we truly have in October is a creative time of nature. It brings forth the dynamic colors of foliage, which brightness brings smiles to the faces of both the young and the old. Along with its realization that the sense of living at this moment is a special occasion where the change is upon us, and we all should look to the heavens above, knowing that there is good things to happen. Indeed, we are blessed to realize how the specialness of each of these months of October has a season that gives us and the surrounding world a joyful place for all of us to proudly call our home. So that's the message for October from Mary Todd Lincoln in 1883. But I think it's very applicable to today when you look at all the older trees that we have in Batavia and how well they've all been maintained, and you know, the trees and being planted here is part of Batavia's legacy that really goes forth. Now, I got 2 minutes left, and I want to tell you what I'm planning to do next year, and I may not have to talk as much. In 1982, I'm now the mayor in 1982, 1983 was going to be our sesquicentennial year, our 150th birthday. So I said to my boys at the Batavia Police Department, you know, I think it would be real nice if we put cars in the squad cars starting in January of '82, and for the entire year, we just, as we're patrolling Batavia, if we see some unique scene or site or people, we take pictures of it. And so that in '83, we can create a special commemoration called Batavia, a Tribute to Its Time. And so Bob Popick, Denny Anderson, and Tim Mayer were the three that did this. And Bob Popick found that we had a Batavia police officer by the name of Tom Lambert, whose cousin ran the visual center for Sears Roebuck in downtown Chicago. And so the boys took all these slides for 12 months and put them on cassettes. And a couple places we went, some of you may remember this, we went and showed this program on slides, but we kept having to change the slides. But then we took it into Sears, to their department in there, and Popick, I think, spent maybe 2 days in there with them. And they got the whole thing put on the DVD. And it's all set to music, and it's very, very nice. And I think next year, one of the things I may do is play that DVD, and then Todd Davis, who's my guy from the city IT department, is my expert, and he keeps me totally out of trouble with all this. We'll be able to stop this every now and then and talk about what the last 5 minutes of this movie have just shown. But what's really good about it, it's got a lot of pictures of many people who have died. And I mean, there's some really great shots of, say, Bert Johnson and Bill Rochelle. And there's other shots of some of the well-known teachers in Batavia that were there. And I think many of you, being old-time Batavians, would really get a kick out of seeing this movie that we made for the sesquicentennial. So I've already told our director here that I've already got my program in mind for next year. So I think it will be in Lee Moorhead's dream. We're maintaining the Batavia legacy of the good things that happen, and what a nice town we are, with great churches and great folks, and we all look out for each other and make this a very special place. So thank you very much.
Thank you.